Well, hello and welcome to this special event on Patrick Geddes. I'm Dr. Scott Lyle, the chair for today's event, and I'm also the project leader for the Scottish Revival Network, which is a collaborative project between Edinburgh Napier University and the University of Stirling, funded by the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And the aim of the network is to investigate the nature and importance of cultural and literary revival in Scotland in the years from around 1880 to 1950. Patrick Geddes is central to those movements of revival, and our speakers will examine his influence from various perspectives today. Those speakers are Professor Murdo Macdonald, who is an Emeritus Professor of History of Scottish Art at the University of Dundee, Dr. Elsa Richardson, Lecturer and Chancellor's Fellow at the University of Strathclyde, and Dr. Michael Shaw, Lecturer in Scottish Literature at the University of Stirling and my project partner for the Scottish Revival Network. Their papers will explore Geddes's motivations for a cultural revival in Scotland, his reception by the Scottish literary renaissance, and the broader culture of revivalism in Scotland during the period in question. And I'll tell you a bit more about each speaker immediately prior to their talks. Each speaker will talk for around 20 minutes, and once the talks are all over, we will open things up to you, the audience, for a Q&A. But please feel free to put your questions as they occur to you into the Q&A link on Zoom, and I will try to read those out. Or if you would like to talk, you can raise your hand in the Q&A link. This event is being recorded and captions are available. So to get the captions, you need to click on the live transcript link at the bottom of your page, but only the panelists will be on video. And I'd be grateful if you'd please keep your mic off unless you're invited to talk. The event is organised by the Scottish Revival Network in association with the Patrick Geddes Centre, and I'm delighted that we are joined by Una Richards, who is the Chief Executive of the Scottish Historic Buildings Trust. And I'll hand over to Una now to say a few words.
Thank you, Scott. Well, thank you very much for asking me to speak briefly today. We're absolutely delighted to be working with the Scottish Revival Network on this talk, the talks here tonight. As Scott said, I'm Chief Executive of the Scottish Historic Buildings Trust, and I'm sitting in Riddle's Court, which was restored 5 years ago as the Patrick Geddes Centre for Learning. So we are deeply indebted to Geddes for this building and the work that he undertook in this building. And also people like Murdo, who have been part of our journey in this project. So what we are is a building preservation trust. So we take derelict and redundant buildings throughout the whole of Scotland. We find new uses for them. We raise all the money that's required to restore the buildings and give them back to the communities where they sit with a sustainable future. We became involved in Riddle's Court way back in 2008. And where Geddes is of interest to us and why this building has importance to Geddes today is that to a certain extent, we're following in Geddes's footsteps. In the 1870s, by which time the new town had been built and anybody with wealth in the old town had moved over there, the old town was falling into decline. And Patrick Geddes came along and started to acquire these buildings that were falling into disrepair, and he acquired Riddle's Court, which at that time had been built as a grand tenement. But he saw the potential in this building and also saw the need. And I'm in one of the oldest rooms in the building, and I should have probably been sitting in another room where you could see some of Geddes's work, but you can come and see the building or you can visit on our website. So Geddes came along and decided that Riddle's Court was an important building that should be saved because of the fact it was built in the 1560s, so it had a number of years of history at that time. But what he also felt is that the people in the old town should experience what people in the new town were getting, which was air, space, light, and most importantly, sanitation. So he adopted something called conservative surgery for Riddle's Court. And what that meant is he looked at what was important in the building, what was good quality and what should be saved, and what could be taken away to enhance the amenity of the building. So he demolished what were 2 4 tenements in the outer courtyard. And that created the space and the light that was so desired in the new town. But he also brought his own experiences and his own culture to the building. And, you know, he was part of the arts and crafts movement. He was very influenced by a lot of the arts and crafts movement. So he did interesting things for today, which was a number of years ago, and created a beautiful external timber staircase where he'd already demolished a tenement that took away the old stone staircase. But I suppose most importantly for us, and which is why I'm in the wrong room, he created a ceiling that told the story of the history of the building, but also the history of the use that he created for this building, which was one of the first halls of residence for Edinburgh University. And that room became the dining room for the students. So it was instrumental in the people that came and stayed in this building as a student in Edinburgh at the time. And we have, as I say, followed in his footsteps. We've taken this building, we've kept what is good and what is important. We've provided a future for this building, and we're really grateful for his inspiration in doing that. And in all of the learning programs we do within the building, we follow his approach to learning. And so if you haven't visited this building, do please come and visit us at some point. But thank you very much for allowing us to be part of this revival network.
Well, thank you very much, Una, for your support. And yeah, do please visit the Patrick Geddes Centre. Okay, now we'll move over to our first speaker, who is going to be Dr. Elsa Richardson. Elsa is lecturer and Chancellor's Fellow at the University of Strathclyde. Working at the intersection between the medical and cultural history, her research considers the relation of heterodox practices, beliefs and movements to mainstream society and culture, with particular focus on the interaction between medicine and the imagination, science and the supernatural, psychology and the occult. Her first monograph, Second Sight in the 19th Century, Prophecy, Imagination and Nationhood, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2017, examined the place of extraordinary visionary experience in the Victorian scientific and popular imaginary. And I think Elsa's going to tell us a bit more about Geddes's rich intellectual milieu, but I'll let Elsa tell you what she's going to discuss today. Elsa.
Okay, well, many thanks to the Scottish Revival Network for inviting me to speak, and also to the Patrick Geddes Centre for hosting this evening's online event. Well, a thank you and perhaps an apology, because my talk really has very little to say about Geddes himself. He appears, I'm afraid, in a rather minor role, one hardly befitting of an event titled Patrick Geddes and Revival. However, I know that I can rely on my fellow speakers to share their more relevant expertise, allowing me, with your kind permission, to go off on something of a tangent. So the title of my paper today is The Revived Self, Occultism and Folklore of the Fin de Siècle. And in it, I would like to explore what the broader culture of the Scottish Revival might have to tell us about the making of the modern subject, which sounds rather grand, but more simply, I guess my interest lies with how the preoccupations of the Scottish Revival as a literary, artistic and intellectual movement might speak in some ways to the fin de siècle sense of itself as a time of great change and shift. So for many, the turn of the century was experienced as a kind of altered reality, one just coming into existence, and one which required new ways of thinking and new ways of being in the world. Or at least this was certainly the view of the Irish poet William Butler Yeats, who in an 1895 essay predicted that a seismic shift was about to occur in Western society. I cannot get out of my mind, he confessed, that this age of criticism is about to pass, and an age of imagination, of emotion, and moods of revelation is about to come in its place. For certainly, belief in the supersensual world is at hand again. Writing at the close of the 19th century, signs of this coming revolution could be gleaned from numerous and highly varied cultural sources. In London, the Society for Psychical Research were pursuing serious investigations into spiritualistic phenomena, while Madame Blavatsky espoused the wisdom of the East as a route to modern self-knowledge, and theosophical societies sprung up around the country and in many cities and in several cities across Scotland. And popular periodicals like Lucifer and the Occult Review explored ancient hermetic practices and encouraged their readers to look to the pre-modern world for guidance. Yeats's foretold New Age reflected this flowering and multifarious occultism, but his vision centered on a more specific agent of renewal, namely the Celt. As a key participant in what has been broadly termed the Celtic revival, he was deeply invested in the political, artistic, and spiritual potential of the movement. And though necessary distinctions must be drawn, of course, between its different expressions, between perhaps the politicized nationalism guiding the Irish literary revival and the more internationalistic outlook pursued by their Scottish counterparts, its contributors broadly shared in a desire to rediscover, reimagine, and reinvigorate Celtic traditions, literature, and folklore. In the process, they were, of course, compelled to engage with a related inheritance, Matthew Arnold's 1867 study on the study of Celtic literature, which had argued for the existence of a distinctly Celtic element in literature, identified this as typically feminine, superstitious, and naturally spiritual, poetic qualities that, according to Arnold, justified the Celts' political submission to the rationally minded and able-bodied Saxon. By contrast, for a new generation of revivalists, this spiritual, mystical, and ancient Celtic essence was reimagined as a means of transforming the English-speaking world, a way of rewriting culture along radically different lines. And in my talk this afternoon, I guess I would like to think about how this blueprint for a new world was written, and to suggest that part of the work performed by the Scottish Revival involved a reimagining of the unconscious mind and a reconfiguration of its creative powers. Okay, so to begin, I'm going to work through kind of one key example. So I want to turn to a series of letters that were sent by Yeats to two Scottish writers associated with the Scottish Revival: the journalist William Sharp and a mysterious Highland novelist named Fiona Macleod. Connected through common literary endeavours, the three also shared membership to the period's premier magical society, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Established in 1887, this secretive and hierarchical order synthesized several occult traditions, including Renaissance and Egyptian magic, Western esotericism, various Eastern religious traditions, and Neoplatonism, to produce a unique system of magical training for its initiated adepts. Members were schooled in astral travel, incantation, and scrying, methods by which to explore not only the deeper regions of the self, but also other worlds and non-human realms. And these explorations were underpinned by several texts, decoded by one of the founding members, William Wynne Westcott, and containing within them the rituals and graduated teachings that the movement would eventually adopt. Temples were later established outside of London, in Weston-super-Mare, Bradford, Paris, and eventually in Edinburgh, where the Amun-Ra temple was founded in 1893. So sadly, the exact location of this temple is not known, but we do know that it was in operation until 1912, and that its initiates included the novelist and theosophist John Brodie Innes, the anthropologist Robert Falcon, and the astronomer William Peck. And as my fellow panelist Michael Shaw has explored in his work, the firmest link between the Amun-Ra temple and the public literary world inhabited by Patrick Geddes and the like was formed through the Cornish writer Ricardo Stevens, who was an initiate of the temple and a contributor to the Evergreen. The magical work of the Golden Dawn was, though I want to suggest, bound up with the creative endeavours of the Scottish Revival in some less material and perhaps less obvious ways. So Yeats's letter to William Sharp and Fiona Macleod get to something of what I mean by that. So in May 1898, Yeats had travelled to Paris to work with Samuel Liddell MacGregor Mathers, one of the founding members of the order, and his partner Moyna Mathers. And one evening, while undertaking shared magical rites, the group encountered the astral form of a man dressed in a number of clan tartans, whose presence in the room appeared to communicate some form of psychic trauma, that seemed to be attached to Fiona Macleod. Writing to Sharp the following morning, Yeats recounted the unsettling incident and requested that he pass on an enclosed and sealed letter addressed to Macleod as soon as possible. So in this sealed letter, we're offered a far more detailed account of the incident. Yeats recounts how he was visited by, and I quote, the intellectual body of someone who is passing through an intense emotional crisis. And having confessed that he was inclined to believe that Macleod was the spectral visitor, he asked, and I quote, were you either last night or Sunday night passing through some state of tragic feeling? Writing to Sharp again 2 days later, Yeats advised that though he felt bound not to pry into their private affairs, he felt he must warn him not to, and I quote again, undertake any magical work with Miss Macleod until we meet, as you are both channels for some very powerful beings and some mistake has been made. So what are we as modern readers to make of this strange letter? It appears that through laborious incantations and the reading of ceremonial rites, a ghostly emanation has been raised. A male figure, swathed in tartan, has appeared in the sitting room of a Paris apartment. But what is the nature of these powerful beings and what mistakes exactly have been made? More complicated still, we learn that this tartan-clad apparition is somehow representative of Yeats's female correspondent, a Scottish novelist and poet. What kinds of connections are being drawn between Macleod's emotional state, some state of tragic feeling as Yeats has it, and the almost physical manifestation of the male figure, seemingly without her conscious knowledge, hundreds of miles away? Yet most strange of all is what the letter doesn't know about itself. So for all that we find incomprehensible or elusive about this description of magical rites, the informed reader knows something that Yeats in 1898 does not. Namely, that his two correspondents were not two separate individuals, but one person writing as two. From 1894, Sharp had sustained two writing careers, one maintained under his own name and another under the pseudonym Fiona Macleod, who would eventually far outstrip her creator in terms of sales, celebrity, and credibility. Made famous by the weighty symbolism of works like The Mountain Lovers and The Divine Adventure, Macleod joined a new generation of self-identified Celtic writers, instrumental to the rebirth of interest in Gaelic myth and folklore at the turn of the 19th century. Lauded as the first Highland novelist, she was presented in the popular press as a reticent artist, removed from society and living in the remote Western Isles. As one newspaper put it, and I quote, "She is a Celt of the Celts, from an old Highland family and a child of nature and the open air." From her first publication, rumours concerning the identity of this elusive writer began to circulate. Proposals included Yeats himself, the Irish nationalist Maud Gonne, the poet Nora J. Hopper, with one newspaper finally concluding in exasperated terms that, and I quote, "There's no such person as Fiona Macleod at all, but simply a syndicate of young Celtic authors who write under that name." This double identity was one sustained by published works and maintained in private correspondence, with Sharp's sister providing handwritten letters and manuscripts from Macleod. Though no one outside of his immediate family circle knew of the true nature of their relationship, Sharp did maintain a close public connection to Macleod, claiming that she was his cousin, reviewing her work, and even writing her biographical entry for Who's Who. And through the closing years of the 19th century, Yeats not only sustained separate friendships with both Sharp and Macleod, but he also rather preferred Macleod to Sharp. The two men had first encountered each other in 1887, and Yeats's first impression of Sharp was not particularly favourable. In a letter, he recounted their first meeting and described having initially loathed, and I quote, "his red British face of flaccid contentment." Though this initial dislike eventually softened somewhat, their relationship remained ambivalent. By contrast, Yeats observed great potential in Macleod's symbolist folktales and praised them as shining examples of a coming revolution, or in his words, an age of imagination, of emotion, of moods of revelation. Sharp died suddenly in Italy in 1901, and after that, the truth of his audacious literary doubling slowly emerged. So far, the critical response to this remarkable project has made much of its gendered dynamic, in how this doubling might have reflected and troubled the stern binaries of Victorian sexual morality, for example. But rather less has been said of what this twinning might reveal of the models of selfhood that were being staked out in their ceremonial magic of the Golden Dawn, and then, I think, creatively realised in the work of the Scottish Revival. Thinking once more of Yeats's sealed letter to Macleod, it seems significant to me that though he wrote in this instance under the assumption that his two correspondents were distinct individuals, the discovery that this was not the case did not completely alter how he envisaged the connection between the two. In a letter to Maud Gonne on learning the truth, he described Macleod as representing, and I quote, "a kind of semi-allegorical description of the adventures of Sharp's own secondary personality and its relation to the primary self," and recounted that this secondary personality, when it awoke in him, wrote in a much more impassioned way. So one could interpret Sharp's authorial doubling, perhaps, as a kind of fragmentation of the self. But I don't think that this is quite what Yeats is getting at here. Although the magical practices of the Golden Dawn, that they were all participant in, relied upon the development of multiple selves, this did not constitute a kind of splitting of the I or represent a crisis of personal identity. Instead, initiates to the order were taught how to develop a magical self, one that was not only realized through the language of the psyche and the unconscious, but was rather developed on astral planes and through the exploration of real but hidden worlds that penetrate our own. In other words, I think it's important to note that the occult self cultivated through ceremonial magic at the Golden Dawn was quite distinct from the understanding of psyche offered up by late Victorian medical psychology, or later by Freudian psychoanalysis. So part of what distinguished this occult self from the psychological self was the conviction that through the cultivation of technique and through a deep understanding of magical texts, that it might be possible to not only transform the self, transform one's identity, but also to somehow remake and re-envisage the world outside of it. And it's here that the private explorations of occultists collided with the public cultures of the Scottish Revival. And this connection was forged, in part, through a reimagining and reclaiming of folkloric traditions. So in an effort led in Scotland by figures like Geddes and Sharp, Indigenous folk cultures were resurrected as vital political and creative resources. This restorative project guided the literary aspirations of the revival, involving the output of publishing houses like Patrick Geddes & Co, and inspiring collections like Lyra Celtica, an anthology of representative Celtic poetry published in 1896, a volume that gathered together the native literatures of Scotland, Wales, Ireland, Cornwall, and Breton. And Brittany rather, reflecting on the pan-Celticism of this edited volume in a letter to the American journalist Horace Scudder, Sharp explained that his enthusiasm for the subject lay not with, and I quote, what is written in Scottish Gaelic or Irish Gaelic, but rather with uncovering the presence of a definable Celtic spirit. This search for an essential Celtic spirit chimed with a broader critique of the methods and motives of institutionalized folk studies being undertaken by writers, artists, and scholars across the Celtic Revival. In the introduction to his fairy and folk tales of the Irish peasantry, for instance, Yeats characterized the scientific pretensions of the folklore society as amounting to little more than a desire, and I quote, for tales in the form of grocer's bills, item fairy king, item the queen. Setting his own studies in opposition, the author explained his antagonism as arising from the shallow understanding of the subject encountered in the folklore society. He wrote, what lover of Celtic lore has not been filled up with a sacred rage when he comes upon an exquisite story dear to his childhood, written out in a newspaper and called science? Engaging here with issues of ownership, national identity, and cultural appropriation, this critique resisted a misreading of folk tales that placed them falsely within the realm of the quantifiable. More than ethnographic curiosities, for revivalists, they represented important routes to self-knowledge. So this insight underpinned an ethnographic study of supernatural belief undertaken by the American anthropologist Walter Yealing Evans Wentz, which was published in 1911. His fairy faith in the Celtic countries argued for a different approach to folklore, one that he described as anthropopsychological. And the strength of this new method, Evans Wentz suggested, was it acknowledged that testimony regarding folklore could also be found in what he described as recent and contemporary psychical experiences. So, discussing the persistence of fairy lore in remote regions, the anthropologist drew a distinction between, and I quote, the natural mind of the uncorrupted Celt, which is ever open to unusual psychical impressions, and the mind of the urban dweller, which he described as tends to be obsessed with business affairs, both during his waking and during his dream states. So the suggestion here is that detached from the materialist preoccupations of the metropolis, the remote Celt not only lives, but thinks differently from his urban dwelling neighbors. So under the gaze of gaze of revivalists, folkloric tales came to represent more than forms of customary knowledge. They also suggested, or seemed to suggest, ancient modes of perception lost to the modern world. And revivalists were interested in exploring what cognitive spaces might be opened up by orality, what ways of thinking and visualizing might be shut off to the literate. And it was with these questions in mind that attempts were made through the closing years of the 19th century to establish an order within the Golden Dawn dedicated specifically to the exploration of Celtic magic. So the Order of Celtic Mysteries was to be based in a ruined castle on the banks of Lough Hee in Ireland, and aimed to devote itself through the use of talisman and tarot to the recovery of Celtic ancestral memory. Its founders, who included Yeats and Maud Gonne, sought to synthesize folklore, ancient saga, and myth with the esoteric precepts of practical magic. And in doing so, I would argue they were attempting to forge a connection between the literary experiments of the revival and their own occult explorations. In Scotland, as again my fellow panelist Michael Shaw's research has uncovered, Patrick Geddes was involved in planning an occult Celtic order that bore some striking resemblance to the one proposed in Ireland. The Evergreen Club, as it was to be known, was to provide an occult mirror to the activities of the Evergreen magazine, a space where the magazine's contributors could explore the mystical possibilities of their literary endeavours, where it might be possible, through the development of ritual and the exploration of talisman, to put the transformative possibilities mapped out in their prose and poetry into some kind of practice. Though neither the Irish order nor the Scottish club really took off, they nonetheless reveal something of how the private explorations of occultists and the public cultures of the revival came to inform one another. So coming towards a conclusion now. In a 1902 essay, William Sharp praised Yeats as, and I quote, "the priest of the symbolic who lives with symbols as others live with facts," so that to him, the imagination is in truth the second sight of the mind. Written into symbolist poetics, the fabled power of second sight, so prominent in Scottish folklore, became exemplary of the tendency of the Celt to see, as Sharp had it, the thing beyond the thing, and to understand the everyday world as a facade. Along similar lines, the practices of the Golden Dawn were, at their core, an espousal of exactly this principle, where imagination is both the formative power that generates the universe and the creative faculty that manipulates it. Which suggests to me that the theories of imagination developed through ceremonial magic had some hand in shaping the literary experiments of writers like Sharp and MacLeod. Mapping where the esoteric activities of an occult order brushed up against the exoteric pursuits of revivalists, and there are many more examples than have been covered here in this short talk, it's clear that as part of its commitment to political, linguistic, and creative regeneration, this heterogeneous movement was invested to varying degrees and in different ways to transforming the modern subject. Looking back to myth and folklore, revivalists sought to not only articulate a discrete and valuable cultural identity, but rather to put the pre-Christian beliefs, incantations, spells, hymns, and superstitions of the Celt to work in the creation of a revived self, one ready to meet the challenge and the promise of a new century. Thanks.
Many thanks, Elsa. That was great. Great talk on the spiritualism and occultism of the Celtic Fan Secla and its connections with folk culture and revivalism. Thank you very, very much. So our next speaker is Professor Murdo Macdonald, Emeritus Professor of History of Scottish Art at the University of Dundee. Murdo was appointed an honorary member of the Royal Scottish Academy of Art and Architecture in 2009, and an honorary fellow of the Association for Scottish Literature in 2016. Among many publications, he is the author of Scottish Art in Thames and Hudson's World of Art series, and Patrick Geddes' Intellectual Origins, which was published in 2020 by Edinburgh University Press. And Murdo is going to talk to us about Geddes and the Scottish literary renaissance. Murdo.
Thanks very much. I'll just share my screen here. What on earth is that doing? Right. Is that sharing for everyone?
Yeah, looks good.
Great, okay. That was a fascinating talk from Elsa. Makes me wish I was talking about something else entirely, like theosophy or something, but all I'm going to do is talk about a good bit of Geddes and education, essentially. So my title is Geddes and Renaissance, and I've spelt it in Geddes's way rather than McDermott's way, but it's all the same. So I begin with the point of origin, so to speak, Patrick Geddes's evergreen essay, This Scots Renaissance, published in 1895. So what for Geddes was requiring revival or rebirth in 1895? The answer to that question could cover everything from the specific condition of the old town of Edinburgh, including, of course, Riddle's Court, to the widest ecological understanding of the planet. But what he is focusing on in that essay is the importance of understanding one's own culture as a starting point. That immediate starting point for Geddes was the cultural pluralism of Scotland, historical, geographical, and linguistic. To make the point, he considers a number of key figures, in particular, the academic and cultural activist, John Stuart Blackie, the novelist Robert Louis Stevenson, and the Scots language poet and collector Alan Ramsay, and the early Celtic Christian leader, Saint Columba. Right, better use one of these things. The essay begins with the funeral of John Stuart Blackie, who had died in the March of that same year of 1895. For Geddes, Blackie epitomised an appreciation of Scotland and its place in Europe. Blackie was professor of Greek and at the University of Edinburgh, but in addition, he was a strong proponent of Celtic revival and Highland land rights. And one crucial outcome of his efforts was the raising of funds for a chair of Celtic at the University of Edinburgh. Blackie was also an advocate of Robert Burns's poetry and a translator of the ancient Greek poet Aeschylus. So, all in all, a very interesting figure. Blackie seems to have an implicit presence beneath the windows of the Geddes family flat in Ramsay Garden. For there, overlooking the castle esplanade, one finds a sundial bordered by quotations in the Greek of Aeschylus and the Scots of Robert Burns. It dates from 1892. The Aeschylus can be translated as "time refines all things in aging them," and the Burns reads, "It's coming yet for all that." With these two statements from two poets, one originating in ancient Greece, the other originating in 18th century Scotland, Geddes emphasizes the mutual illumination of alphabets, of languages, of poets, and of periods of history. John Stuart Blackie's own translation of the Aeschylus quotation reads, "Time that smooths all things." So for Geddes, the message transmitted by the sundial quotations is that the smoothing power of time is enabling a better future, but that future is coming yet for all that. Now, John Stuart Blackie was a friend of a man for whom Geddes had great admiration, the Russian anarchist Peter Kropotkin. And it's particularly interesting to note that Kropotkin attended a party at Geddes's Edinburgh flat. This would not be the Ramsay Garden one, but I think the James Court one in 1886. Now, Kropotkin at the time was staying with Blackie, and Geddes's friend and close contemporary James Mavor, another very interesting figure of this network, describes the party in his autobiography. It must have been quite an occasion. Among those present was a young Norwegian studying with Geddes at the Marine Biological Station at Granton. This was Fridtjof Nansen, who would in due course become one of the greatest of all polar explorers. His presence underlines that for Geddes, a necessary part of cultural revival was scientific research. Now, Mavor also notes the presence at Geddes's party of the socialist thinker Thomas Kirkup. And in a most amusing sentence, he writes, Kropotkin and I alternately hammered Marx, and Kirkup spoke up for him, and we had an excellent discussion. As I say, it sounds like quite a party. So Geddes's contact with Kropotkin while the latter was staying with Blackie provides further context for understanding the message of the Ramsay Garden sundial. One might even consider the historicist quotations from Aeschylus on the one hand and Burns on the other as Geddes's tribute not just to Blackie, but to Kropotkin also. A further tribute to Blackie came in the naming of Blackie House on the Mound in Edinburgh, a newly converted tenement that became one of Geddes's halls of residence in 1897, linking into others such as, of course, Riddle's Court. Now, that building was again given a physical signature, not with a sundial this time, but with the decoration of an oriel window looking towards Princess Street. On it is carved a portrait of Blackie, flanked by a thistle and a harp, as we see here. So Blackie's death was significant for Geddes, and it's not surprising that it is the starting point for his Scots Renaissance essay. But Geddes soon complements Blackie's role in that Renaissance with the role of Robert Louis Stevenson, who had died in 1894. Now, I had to cut this talk massively, and one bit that I cut out, but I think I'll reinstate, is how delighted I am that Michael Shaw has begun to bring Stevenson back to life from a revivalist perspective. But from Geddes's point of view, Stevenson is a good fit for his Scots Renaissance essay because, quite apart from being a brilliant writer, Stevenson was deeply knowledgeable about Scotland and, like Geddes, deeply internationally inclined. However, one might think that Geddes is being a bit nostalgic here. But in fact, his purpose is the reverse. The point for Geddes is that although individual people like Blackie and Stevenson die, their ideas do not, and the communities of which they are part do not. Thus, we see Geddes thinking in terms of social evolution, the continuous rebirth of culture with each generation building on the insights of its predecessors. However, Geddes is equally aware that each generation can exacerbate the failures of its predecessors also. That's where Renaissance comes in. It is essentially a question of leading social evolution in the right direction, taking heed of Blackie as Celticist and classicist, taking heed of Stevenson as both Scottish and global in attitude. Geddes's underlying point is therefore educational. He makes it forcefully when he laments the way Scottish education ignores Scottish culture, and by doing so, ignores the bases of Scottish success both locally and internationally. And one might say much of what he says still applies today. For example, he is scathing of Scottish culture being recognized only through celebration rather than education. And I quote, we have gone on increasing our libations and orations every St. Andrew's Day, the same for St. Robbie's and now for St. Walter's, till all the world must perforce join our revels. But all this while the history we boast of has become well nigh unknown among us. Geddes's point is that it is not enough to celebrate one's culture through such stereotypes. One must teach it too, and that such education is fundamental to the Renaissance that is required. So the Scots Renaissance message is simply to teach and understand your own culture in an international context, or to put it another way, to attend to both Blackie and Stevenson in the curriculum, rather than just marking their passing. Geddes then anchors his essay in two other figures, one relatively recent, the 18th century poet Alan Ramsay, the other from a much earlier period, the Celtic saint, Saint Columba, whose monasteries in Iona and elsewhere created the manuscripts that the artists of Geddes's circle revisited in their work. In his Scots Renaissance essay, Geddes reflects not only on the person of the saint, but on the revival of that Celtic decoration. One finds that expressed in initial letters by Helen Hay and John Duncan, as we see here, from the first volume of the Evergreen. Further reference to St. Columba can be found in both Lyra Celtica, and I was delighted to hear a mention of that already, a remarkable anthology of Celtic verse published by Geddes and colleagues in 1896 and edited by Elizabeth Sharp, William Sharp's wife. And then in 1897, Columba is again mentioned in a booklet marking the 13th century of the saint's death. That drew on designs already published in the Evergreen, and here we see one by John Duncan on the cover. The Lyra Celtica one is by Helen Hay. And in the Scots Renaissance essay, Columba, the Gaelic speaker, is complemented by Alan Ramsay, the Scots speaker. The significance of Alan Ramsay is underlined in the prefatory note to the second volume of the Evergreen, which builds very much on what Geddes has said in the Scots Renaissance essay. This is how that note begins. In 1724, Alan Ramsay published his Evergreen, desiring thereby to stimulate the return to local and national tradition and living nature. We who inherit Ramsay's old home and would also follow in his steps as workers and writers, publishers and builders, seeking to gather such traditions as still linger around us, to set down such thought or song as may be in ourselves, hopeful at least of suggesting better things to those who will follow us here. Now, that paragraph sets out the wider Geddes project very clearly. Geddes called his publisher Patrick Geddes and colleagues, and that's a significant use of language, for those colleagues were, paraphrasing the prefatory note, along with Geddes, the inheritors of Alan Ramsay's old home, following in his footsteps as workers and writers, publishers and builders. Symbolic of that educational renaissance was the mural scheme for the common room of the student residence of Ramsay Lodge, where in 1896, Geddes drew on the work of 4 artists who were also working on the Evergreen. They created a remarkable sequence of murals bordered by and linked to one another by Celtic interlaced designs. The central mural panels are by John Duncan, and they survive today. Unfortunately, most of the borders, painted by Duncan's students, Helen Hay, Marion Mason, and Nellie Baxter, only survive as fragments. Photographs taken at the time give us some idea of what has gone missing, as we can see in this image, which shows the wonderful borders surrounding Duncan's Awakening of Cahulan. For Geddes, those interlaced borders were extremely important, and I will say more about them in a moment. But first, I will consider the central panels by John Duncan from Geddes's interdisciplinary perspective. The images chosen for those panels can be seen as a visual manifesto for Geddes's educational renaissance. They bring together legend, history, and interdisciplinary learning in a location dedicated to students. The anchor image, as we've already seen, is the Awakening of Cahulan, a work which identifies the need for Celtic revival, a manifesto work, if you like, a call to cultural awakening. It leads to The Combat of Finn, which shows a scene derived from Macpherson's Ossian. And Ossian was a work which Geddes and colleagues would publish in a new edition, edited by William Sharp in that very same year of 1896. The third panel moves us from the Gallic Celticism of Cuchulainn and Ossian to the Brythonic Celticism of King Arthur in the taking of Excalibur. The identification in the text accompanying the mural of Arthur with Arthur's seat in Edinburgh is probably erroneous, but the wider point is correct, namely that Brythonic Celtic culture, that's to say Celtic culture linked to what we now call the Welsh language, is important in the whole of the south of Scotland. And that is the point that Geddes is making. The next panel continues that southern Scottish theme with the image of the journey of St. Mungo on his way to bury the body of St. Fergus in the location of what is now Glasgow Cathedral. That mural thus introduces Christianity into this visual history of Scottish ideas, but with strong hints in the imagery of an earlier pagan bull cult. Following it is an image inspired by the writings of the great Irish theologian of the 9th century, the vision of Johannes Scotus Erigena. Johannes, or John Scotus Erigena, was the most renowned Gaelic-speaking philosopher and theologian of his time, and his work was studied throughout Europe. This mural thus makes the simple point that Celtic intellectual culture has its place at the heart of Europe. It also introduces for the first time a figure associated with what we would today call higher education. Now, that higher educational point is complemented in the next panel by the thinking of the early 13th century mage and scientist of European reputation, Michael Scott, renowned for not only his magical activities, which link up with the previous talk, I think, but also for his translations of Aristotle from Arabic to Latin. The final figure of the group painted in 1896 is of the 16th century scholar, the Admirable Crichton. Crichton is shown during his visit to Venice, standing in the Piazzetta close to the Doge's palace. Crichton was the Scottish Renaissance scholar par excellence, traveling to universities in France and Italy in particular, and disputing and fencing wherever he went. His inclusion thus strikes his inclusion strikes a personal note for Geddes, for he is thought to have been educated at Geddes's old school, the Grammar School of Perth, before studying at St. Andrews University. Thus, the scheme proceeds from legend through the beginnings of educational history to exemplary scholarship. At the same time, it begins with Celtic culture and becomes increasingly European, but never losing touch with its Scottish starting point. However, whatever the importance of John Duncan's panels, the now lost interlaced borders were also crucial to Geddes's conception of the Ramsay Lodge Common Room. The fact that they have much more than a mere framing function is made very clear in Geddes's own account of them. Leave the pictures then for a moment and take their tracery borders, he says, follow them round the walls, watch them until the interweaving threads begin to twist and the mazy spirals spin. Here are line and color woven into patterns, changing as they go, 16 designs round a single picture. There is no mechanical repetition as in more familiar styles. Each device is a separate living thought, a separate expression of a separate life moment of the artist, expressible only in the medium of line and color, like a chord of music. Now, some idea of the visual environment created can be gained from this composite of the images of the first two panels. As you can see, what Geddes and his artists had in mind was a total experience, a complete visual experience, and indeed intellectual experience. I would remind you that the scheme was carried out only a year after the publication of Geddes's Scots Renaissance essay. The Ramsay Lodge murals are thus an example of Geddes's Scots Renaissance in practice. The comparative interdisciplinary aspect of Geddes's thinking should be noted. It's the method that George Davey would later describe as the Scottish generalist tradition, or more concisely, the democratic intellect. In the democratic intellect, published in 1961, Davey notes Geddes as part of that Scottish generalist tradition. A few years later, in 1966, Davey's friend Hugh McDermid published the second volume of his autobiography, The Company I've Kept, in which both Davey and Geddes figure. So the Geddes link to McDermid is surprisingly easy to make, for chapter 3 deals extensively with his work. McDermid was also on terms of friendship with Geddes from the early 1920s onwards. It's interesting to note that their link seems to have come about when Geddes wrote to McDermid after he had read his poetry, and that in a way links us back straight to Alan Ramsay. Thus we find the Scots Renaissance of Patrick Geddes directly linked to the Scottish Renaissance of Hugh McDermid through McDermid's own words. I conclude with a quotation. What then is this Scotland of ours? What life does it actually show? What ideas and what aims are nascent among its youth? What manner of history will they make? What literature will they write? And we, what counsel in thought, what initiative in action can we offer them? Here are questions, as our Scottish manner is, to ask rather than answer, but to which at some other season we may well return. Now, if someone had told me that Hugh McDermid had written that in the 1920s, I think I would have accepted it. But the author is Patrick Geddes in 1895 in his Scots Renaissance essay for the Evergreen. There's much else to say, but for the moment I leave you with the continuity of the Scots Renaissance of the 1890s and the Scottish Renaissance of the 1920s through the friendship and shared interdisciplinary commitment of Hugh McDermid and Patrick Geddes. Thank you for listening.
Many, many thanks, Murdo. Great talk. Inviting us to think about the links between Geddes's Renaissance and the later Renaissance, I suppose, inaugurated by McDermid of the 1920s. Thank you very, very much indeed. Our final speaker is Dr. Michael Shaw, who is lecturer in Scottish literature at the University of Stirling. His research focuses on Scottish literature and art in the 19th and early 20th centuries, with a particular emphasis on the 1890s. His first monograph, The Fin de Siècle, Scottish Revival, Romance, Decadence and Celtic Identity, published by Edinburgh University Press in 2019, explores the ways in which dissident Fin de Siècle styles and ideas were embraced by Scottish writers and artists, hoping to develop a comparable cultural revival to the Irish literary revival. And in 2020, he completed an edition of literary correspondence between Robert Louis Stevenson and J.M. Barrie, published by Sandstone Press. And Michael will discuss Geddes in relation to the Celtic revival. Michael.
Well, thank you very much, Scott. And yes, thank you everyone for attending. And also thank you to Una for having us today in the Patrick Geddes Centre more widely. And perhaps particular thanks to Elsa and Murdo for absolutely fascinating talks that they just gave. And yeah, this talk I'm going to give is very nicely going to follow on from the ideas that Murdo was just articulating there on Geddes and learning. Because yeah, one of the things that I'm wanting to focus on in this paper is how Geddes's interests in child study, in children and youth culture, how they might intersect with the Celtic revival and Scottish cultural revivalism more widely. And then from there, I'm going to get very tentative and start to think about how sort of Geddes's ideas around youth and cultural revival might link or might stand at odds with the Scottish Renaissance later from the 1920s onwards. Okay, so I'll just make this full screen so you can see the quotes better. Here we go. Okay, so I'm going to kick off with this quotation, which is from the second stanza of a poem that was published as part of a student magazine at Dundee University in 1905. It was titled "The New Education or Botany" in 1905, which is a pseudonymous poem. You'll see why when we read through it. Because what this poem is it's a parodic poem, where Geddes is the speaker and one of Geddes' students is satirising him and his sort of educational outlook in the poem itself. And again, I should say, very thankful to Matthew Jarron, who published this in his article, "Forget the silly notion that I'm here to teach you botany," which is about Patrick Geddes at University College Dundee. So the stanza reads, "Come all ye products of the schools, on facts and figures fed, on undiluted nature sate your appetites instead. Forget your empty parrot talk, your meaningless verbosity, and let the honest sense of things arouse your curiosity." What we're seeing in this stanza via this parody of Geddes is some of the ideas that Murdo was just articulating on Geddes's frustrations with the way that children, young people, young adults are taught, finding that they are far too often simply regurgitating facts and figures, that too often they are focused on textbook learning, that they're simply being trained to conduct examinations. What Geddes wants to develop instead is an education that is focused on nature learning, focusing on nature, and as we'll see as I go through as well, learning through drama, learning through mural painting, and various other experiences. What this quotation speaks to, I think, though, is the fact that Geddes has these new ideas about how education should be structured and new ideas about childhood. And in that sense, he's very much speaking to his era, which was sort of seen, the late 19th century, seen as an emergence or re-emergence of a focus on the child and childhood. Geddes himself noted that this was a kind of key part of the zeitgeist in the 1890s. He wrote, "For the young giant of Rabelais is stirring among us. The Orbis Pictus of Comenius anew opens before our eyes. Rousseau's Emile continues his glorious youth, and Pestalozzi's Gertrude is again guiding her children through a larger growth cycle." I should say that's a quotation from his review of G. Stanley Hall's book, Adolescence, which is a very formative text that focuses on the fact that adolescence is sort of the key stage in human development. And Stanley Hall says that actually if the human as a race is to be perfected, we need to focus on that period of adolescence and perfecting it. And then more broadly, in that review as well, Geddes says the child movement has been thoroughly popularised. We can find this in various different forms in Geddes's works. For instance, he was corresponding with Clementina Anstruther-Thompson, who in the early 20th century was involved in the Girl Guides, and he was recommending the magazine Child Study to her, which we can see in this letter, where he says, "On subject of measuring capacity by better than school exams, see Child Study, magazine of the Child Study Society. The time is ripe for that uplift in education which both sides of party politics agree as yet in practically ignoring," which is quite an interesting statement here, and that Geddes is acknowledging that there is this large and broad movement to focus on the child and to develop a more child-centred learning, but he's also acknowledging that nevertheless educational parties and national education is ignoring those developments in that research. We can see through various different efforts that Geddes is involved in this period that he is trying to think of new forms of education that he thinks is more child-centric. We see this, I suppose, in the fact that Geddes and his colleague Victor Branford were very supportive of the Scouting movement, which sort of builds on Clementina Anstruther-Thompson's enthusiasm for the Girl Guides. And one of the things that John Scott and Ray Bromley identify in their book Envisioning Sociology is the fact that Geddes and Bramford argued that the Scouting movement, quote, in its origin and growth recapitulates with curious fidelity the natural divergences of the primitive hunting life. And this links back to Geddes's ideas that we need to sort of uncover and to preserve those sort of primitive energies and link them into other forms of intellectual curiosity. It's also commented on in that book, Envisioning Sociology, that Bramford and Geddes had, as they write, considerable sympathy with emerging progressive school, the emerging progressive school movement, and the educational ideas of Pestalozzi, Montessori, and Rudolf Steiner. And you can see how some of these thinkers' ideas are reflected in some of Geddes's quotes. For instance, he's quoted as saying that the child's desire of seeing, touching, handling, smelling are all true and healthy hungers, and these should be cultivated. So rather than traditional education in this period that's trying to repress these particular hungers or desires or curiosities, Geddes is interested in how to help children express them and to develop them. I think the other thing that's worth bearing in mind here is that while I'm focusing on youth and particularly on children just now, for Geddes, the idea of youth is not necessarily limited to a particular age, and he's very much building on Stanley Hall's ideas here. In his essay on Stanley Hall, view of Stanley Hall, he writes, well, he quotes Stanley Hall saying, the best definition of genius is intensified and prolonged adolescence. And Geddes very much shared this idea of maintaining that sort of initial form of childhood, or that sense of adolescence into adult life, how to sustain these curiosities that children and adolescents have. So that gives us an introduction to Geddes and his involvement in this sort of growing youth or child movement and child study at the time. And it sits alongside, interestingly, other movements that are occurring around this period that are much more connected or closely connected to cultural nationalism. And those are the youth movements of Young Ireland, Young Belgium, Young Poland, that are focusing on how well, they're young groups of writers and intellectuals and thinkers who are trying to defend their culture and to embody forms of cultural revival, although they all take very different forms. And in some ways, there is an equivalent of that happening in Scotland, quite explicitly so. One aspect of it, politically, is the Young Scots Society, which was formed in 1900 after a big Liberal defeat in the general election. And the Young Scots were groups of Liberals who were sort of thinking about how do we reanimate and re-strengthen the party. And they had various different issues that they were concerned with, but increasingly over the course of, well, up until about 1906, 1907, they became very much focused on Scottish Home Rule. Interestingly, Geddes presented at the Dunfermline Young Scots Society. He was meant to chair a lecture on heredity and social progress, but the lecturer, Stanton Colt, couldn't make it due to illness, so Geddes just decided that he'd give his own lecture on heredity and social progress. And in his archives as well, Geddes kept one of the pamphlets of the Young Scots Society titled 60 Points for Scottish Home Rule. So that gives us a sense of the sort of political aspect of Young Scotland, but actually there is a cultural side to it as well, and that's something that Geddes is very much at the heart of, which Murdo has sort of introduced us to already with the Scots Renaissance. The only reference that I've found explicitly to the idea of a Young Scotland is William Sharp, who of course Elsa's introduced us to in the first talk. In one of his letters to Edmund Clarence Stedman, he specifically links the Evergreen to this idea of Young Scotland. He writes, "Tell Mrs. Stedman that the copy of the Evergreen I shall send in a fortnight or so is really for her. It's a beautiful production in its format, and she used to keep it in her drawing room for a little and show it to her literary friends as the organ of Young Scotland." And tied to that, Megan Ferguson has very accurately noted the fact that Geddes is trying to create a community of young scholars, young thinkers, young artists and writers around him to sort of add fuel to this Edinburgh Celtic revival. It is very much a young movement, which is partly why William Sharp is attributing that expression, Young Scotland, to the Evergreen. I suppose one of the things that I'm trying to think through here is, are these two phenomena that Geddes is involved in, this sort of emergence of a young Scotland cultural movement, a Scottish revival, and his interest in child study, do they intersect in any way? And I think the answer is yes, on quite a few grounds. I think we see it when we turn to the Evergreen. The Evergreen, of course, is a sort of mad magazine in a sense that brings together lots of different types of contributions. So we get sociological essays, scientific essays, we get quite extended discussions on artistic debates, for instance, on decadence in the period. And of course, there's lots of illustrations that owe a debt to Aubrey Beardsley. But alongside all of those contributions, we also get a lot of material that seems to be aimed at children or at young people, or at least is sort of making references out to that community. We see it, of course, with Charles Mackey's illustration here, when the girls come out to play. And we also see it in The Carol of Youth by Hugo Laubach, and also in The Crows, a child poem by Gabrielle Seaton. And I think this concern with youth that we get in the Evergreen is also quite clearly voiced in the Scots Renaissance itself. So I'll just go through a couple of quotes here that again demonstrate the fact that although Geddes is starting off with John Stuart Blackie, starting on with the death of Blackie and of Blackie and Stevenson, there is a concern with youth and emergence in that essay. So one of the first quotes that we get from the Scotch Renaissance is where Geddes writes, "Though age pass away at evening and manhood be reft from us at noon, new dawn ever comes, and with it new youth." So it's this sort of sense in tune with the seasonal nature of the Evergreen, that something passes and something rises, something's emergent that comes from it. And that's part of what's happening with his depiction of the funerals of Blackie and Stevenson. He's seeing them falling, but as Murdo said, there is that continuation of their ideas which can rise up in a new generation. We also see the hope that Geddes has that the Evergreen is going to stimulate future writers. And this comes through when he's discussing Alan Ramsay's Evergreen, as well as Scott. So he writes that Alan Ramsay's Evergreen helped to urge succeeding writers to higher issues, among which even Percy's Relics and Scots Border Minstrelsy are reckoned. So our new Evergreen may here and there stimulate some new and younger writer. So there's this hope that a sort of equivalent of Scott could emerge from the Evergreen and its community. Towards the end of the Scotch Renaissance, we also get a focus on children and on teaching. And that is the moment where Geddes discusses Grimston, the town just outside Falkirk. And what he's interested in there is the military hero of Grimston, and he wants teachers to go to his tomb and to the stones at his tomb, and to sort of arouse their sense of hero worship, I suppose, in both Wallace, who Graham fought alongside, and also Blind Harry. So he writes, "And so in some young soul here and there, the spirit of the hero and the poet Wallace and Blind Harry may awaken." He's imagining the teacher here reading out Blind Harry's Wallace to the pupils, and for them to get this sort of awakening through that process. And that stress on education that we see there, and how education could play a role in the Scottish revival, is evident in quite a lot of Geddes's different initiatives. So one of the things he was very supportive of was the idea of scholars, students, and even potentially children going out into the world and touring around Europe and potentially further afield in order to get their education. He writes that a new generation is growing up accustomed from its youth to rapid and independent touring, donning a new conception of education that's no longer primarily based on the tradition of the book, but on actual personal knowledge of the world. And in the second quote here, we see how that enthusiasm he has, how it can directly link into Scottish cultural revivalism. He writes, here we are fortunately able to utilise those wide and varied personal relations which many of us have made abroad with the many colleagues and guests of our annual summer meeting, which was held in Edinburgh, where the most varied schools of thought are represented. The Scottish student is again beginning to wander as of old, and the readers of Hilberton's Scott Abroad, for whom the ancient league with France may seem an old and half-forgotten story, will soon hear of the Société Franco-Écossaise. So what Geddes is suggesting here is that through these sort of international trips that students might make, that is how they're going to build up these old continental sympathies with Europe. He's very keen to develop, and as he states in the Evergreen, he sees that as underpinning the Scots Renaissance. And it's linked into what Murdo was saying, that while being both national is also looking out to the wider world. Alongside his support for touring, he's also very supportive of pageantry, historical pageantry. So pageants were these sort of processional events of historical eras or particular events in which large crowds would gather to watch. And Geddes said that these were key to remusing youth. In his essay on the significance and purpose of the masks or the pageants, they mean the same thing. To remuse youth and the people, that is the problem. Here at length, we come to the central problem and significance of our masks, their inmost aim and outward endeavour, to re-establish a common culture, civic, national and general. How to aid this improvement at all levels has long been a main activity of the Outlook Tower. But of all these endeavours, the maskers is the most ambitious and comprehensive. So he's really seeing pageantry as one of the key activities that he's engaged with in the 20th century to help remuse the youth and society more broadly. He also sees pageantry as being key to nurturing a sense of folklore and to challenging centralisation, sort of linking into some of the ideas that Elsa was saying earlier. And the quote at the bottom is Victor Branford saying something quite similar, I suppose, commenting on the latent possibilities of dramatised education. So it's unsurprising that Geddes wanted his children to be part of national pageants. Indeed, his wife was involved in, Anna Geddes, she was involved in setting up the Celtic costumes for the Scottish national pageant. And here we see two of his children. We see Arthur and Alistair. Arthur is Harper to Finn, and Alistair as Rider to the She. I tried to find a picture of Nora, who played Niamh, but I couldn't find a photograph of her, unfortunately. But more broadly, Geddes advocated a revival of Celtic dress, especially for their boys and girls. That's actually him saying that himself. And this was a sort of important facet of it for Geddes, that it wasn't just for children to watch these spectacles of history, but to participate in them as well. He believed that through that dramatising of history, that's how they could learn about it better. It was much better to perform a historical figure than to read about it in a book that would aid education to do it that way. And following on from the Scottish national pageant, Geddes then constructed his own mask, which is the mask of ancient, medieval and modern learning. And what's interesting about that particular pageant is that it starts off with a school child who is sort of centred, and the school child comes in with school bag on and all of its books, and then a professor comes down, most likely modelled on Geddes, looks at the school bag and says, oh, this is ridiculous, you're never going to learn anything with these books. What's better for you is if you are taken under the spell of the pageant. And then the boy witnesses the pageant, which is a huge pageant that covers everything from education right at the beginnings of times up into more modern times. And it said at the end, our schoolboy, now a student citizen, as later in life he will be a citizen student, as torchbearer leading the way, with a child also perpetual symbol of the future. So I think I'm actually just wondering about time, because I want to kind of think about the Scottish Renaissance. So I might pass over this, but I think the only thing to highlight here is just the fact that Geddes is clearly embracing forms of popular culture here through his support of pageantry, and also, as we see in the Scottish Renaissance and the megalithic builders, his support of Kailyard writing and his support of Stevenson. And that, I suppose, is quite a marked difference that we get in terms of some of the later Scottish Renaissance writers, which David Goldie was commenting on in one of our previous sessions, in the sense that they often distance themselves from popular culture and saw the Scottish Renaissance as a more elite form. And yet the other, Stevenson and Phoebe Anna Squares, just to point out that this is a much broader interest in childhood in Scotland at this time. So in terms of the Scottish Renaissance in youth, I'm trying to work out whether there's continuity here with Geddes or whether there's a rupture with Geddes. Because on the one hand, we do find in Scottish Renaissance writing that there is a real identification with youth, that lots of Scottish Renaissance writers style themselves as young writers and part of a young movement. We see that in David Cleghorn Thompson's book, Scotland, Quest for Youth. George Blake stated that we are very young, very ambitious. Naomi Mitchison said that Scotland must learn not to be ashamed of its own youth and vigour. And like William Sharp, Hugh McDiarmid applauded the young Belgian writers. So in that sense, there is something similar in that trying to style themselves as a young movement and to tap into their youth and vigour. But at the same time, and we've seen this in previous workshops for this network, particularly in thinking of Glenda Norquay's presentation on Stevenson, where later Renaissance writers are often looking back on the writers of the 1890s, for instance, and sort of being quite condescending in the way that they see those writers as being immature or as being too kind of childish. We see that with the two quotations of Stevenson in the middle here, but then also William Sharp was described by Hugh McDiarmid as having a passionate prematurity, and Lewis Spence commented on the 19th century as being the most jeune period in Scottish letters, again suggesting there was a sort of naivety. So yeah, I'm trying to work out, I suppose here, if this does mark a sort of break in a sense, or if the case is that the later Renaissance writers, looking back, are just not quite tapping into the fact that for Geddes and for other figures, that they see childhood and youth as an integral part of the Scottish revival. And they're trying to draw from that sort of culture of youth and child study and to integrate it into their ideas about revival. And maybe that's something that the Scottish Renaissance is just overlooked when it's sort of condescendingly associating it with immaturity and youth. Okay, but I shall leave it there. And yeah, thank you for listening.
No, thanks, Michael. What a fascinating talk, and open up lots of new avenues that I was personally unaware of in relation to this idea of a potential kind of young Scotland and the links with other ideas of revival there. So thank you very, very much for that. If we could have our other speakers back, Murdo and Elsa, we've got some time for questions from the audience, please. So please put your questions in the Q&A, and I'll try and pick those up. There's a couple of questions in the Q&A at the moment. The one that I'll take first is from Robert John Morris, who asks, any thoughts on how the First World War impacted on the cultures you have all described? That question was put in the chat before Michael started talking, but actually I wonder if it still relates to some extent to what you were discussing, Michael, there as well, with perhaps some of the differences between the perhaps more hopeful or child-centered kind of narratives that you were discussing in the Renaissance of Geddes, and then perhaps the switch to a more pessimistic approach to some extent in the Renaissance. But I don't know who wants to come in on that one. Perhaps Michael first, actually, in terms of answering that question. If you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a really great question. Yeah, and I think Scott's right that there is a growing sense of pessimism and a sense that, yes, society is in a sense matured in a way, and that has led to a different viewpoint when looking back at the 1890s. I think another way there's a shift, just thinking about with the scouting movement that Geddes and Bramford were very supportive of, but during the First World War they weren't supportive of it because they felt it had become too kind of militarist, which again I think is interesting, sort of highlighting the limits of the cultural revival maybe for Geddes, in the sense that it's just becoming a bit too political maybe, or getting too sort of, it's sort of crossing that boundary. Reminds me of the fact that there's a quite clear comparison between Geddes and a lot of kind of Irish revival activity around pageantry, which again was about sort of encouraging a sort of military sort of demeanour in young children. So yeah, that's another way in which there's a shift that we see because of the First World War.
Yeah, I've got a different view on the First World War, which is that its basic problem for Scotland is that it is one of the great centralising influences, as was the Second World War. And whereas Geddes was, he was in a situation of centralisation already, and he says as much, but after the First World War, you get this logic of centralisation kicking in. And that's simply exacerbated by the Second World War. And we're now in the position of recovery from both of those. And I think that's the key thing about the First World War and the Second World War. There may well have been pessimism and all the rest of it, but if you actually look at the Scottish literary Renaissance, the one person who is always forgotten, maybe because of his inherent optimism, is actually Neil Gunn. And of course, he's the one who's very important from a child point of view as well.
Thanks, Murdo. Elsa, what do you think about this impact of the war? I think particularly, in your talk about the spiritualism and the occult, what do you see as the potential connections there?
Well, actually, just to pick up, I guess, on Michael's point about the scouting movement, and that kind of relates to what pops into my head when the question was first posed, was I think that, I guess this is perhaps not particularly specific, but just it made me think about the interwar kind of turn towards nature and the interwar turn towards the countryside, but also the kind of re-enchantment of that countryside. So, the scouting movement absolutely during the First World War becomes a kind of military outcrop, let's say. But what's interesting is that after the First World War, it also transforms into the woodcraft society, into the kindred of the Kibble Kif, into these kind of occult and mystically coded woodcrafting societies. And I guess that's not particularly specific to the Scottish revival, say, but I guess the shift that I possibly perceive within Scotland towards kind of growing interest in like cultures of life reform, a growing interest in kind of getting back to the land, a growing interest in kind of self-sufficiency and what it might mean to kind of reconnect with a kind of re-enchanted countryside, I think has some interesting connections with revivalist activities also. I guess there's obviously the very familiar narrative that I'm sure everybody knows, regarding the rise of the spiritualist movement after the First World War as a response to those traumas, within the history of the Order of the Golden Dawn. Obviously that order in its original formation kind of fragments towards at the very beginning of the 20th century, and kind of, there's lots of different kind of factions that go off and do other things. But I think the kind of counter to, I guess, a kind of pessimistic, overly pessimistic reading for me is, might be to think about what happens to the natural world and the way the imagination and a kind of occult imaginary becomes kind of tangled up with that.
Yeah, that's fascinating. There's just so much we could discuss on that front. I think
could I just add something in here? Sure. There was a really interesting question from Tanya Cheadle, and is that still visible to anyone?
I think Tanya's taken that away now.
Tanya, ask your question. Don't be shy.
It was about, I don't know if it's fair to ask it if she's deleted it, but I think it was about the male-centric kind of focus of revival specifically, I think if I remember rightly.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and I
it was
think
the Celtic.
Elsa and myself, do you want to go on that one, Elsa?
Sure. I mean, I can't quite remember what it was. It about something about the masculine tenor of a kind of occultist activity.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. And I think I have, well, yes, as usual, I have a number of things to say about it. One, I would say that, you know, obviously, part of what the work of the kind of ceremonial magic performed by the Order of the Golden Dawn certainly is about, at least in part, a rejection of the kind of supernatural experience played out in the spiritualist seance, right? So a kind of it is a refusal of the kind of passive mediumship of the spiritualist medium, if that makes sense, right? So a passive mediumship, a passive kind of engagement with the other worlds, which is coded specifically as feminine, as feminine, as passive, as unlearned, right? So like ceremonial magic in the Order of the Golden Dawn is about deep learning, is about scholarship, is about the cultivation of like technique, and absolutely the cultivation of expertise, which I think for sure is coded as male. However, I would also say that, like, you know, sure, that's one way of looking at it, but actually if you look at who participated in the ceremonial magic performed by occult groups like the Order of the Golden Dawn, there are so many women present, and so many women who in incredibly kind of prominent and important roles in that society, which to me suggests a more kind of complicated reading. And then I guess that where that intersects with the question of, you know, where that might intersect with the Scottish Revival, Murdo, I'm sure you have lots of interesting things to say on this also. But again, I think it's a really kind of complicated history which resists of a straightforward reading. So on the one hand, obviously, revivalists are, as I mentioned in my talk, obviously kind of entangled with and in a sense, writing with and writing against Matthew Arnold's proposition and figuring of the Celt as essentially kind of, you know, as feminine, as having a poetic sensibility and so on. And I think certainly it's possible to read revivalist activities as kind of, is in some way attempting to kind of work against that or challenge it in some way, or at least, you know, draw attention to kind of its kind of problematic limitations. However, then when you look at a figure like William Sharp, who's actively kind of, you know, cultivating, you know, a second authorial a second authorial persona for himself, which is which is a woman, female writer, and which he imagines and figures in his own kind of private writings as being really kind of like tangled up with his sense of himself as perhaps being kind of doubled, as being androgynous, as having some kind of bisexual aspect. Again, I think, you know, this is a terrible answer because I think the answer that I'm giving is just, it's really complicated. Can
I just
Those are always the best answers, but yeah.
It's definitely really complicated, but it's also a really fascinating one. And I mean, Sharp is intriguing because, of course, the Sharp that we all forget is his wife, Elizabeth. And she was absolutely brilliant. She was an absolutely brilliant editor. And there are a lot of really, really important women, not least John Duncan's students who I drew attention to, who are actually very, very fine. But as usual, there's this kind of somewhat often spurious male leadership and identifying male figures the whole time. Now, to some extent, that's understandable. But there are, as Elsa implies, there are some very interesting exceptions. And one of the exceptions is the person who is actually the model for Anima Celtica, the soul of the Celt. And that is actually Ella Carmichael. Now, Ella Carmichael is not only an interesting woman of the time, she's also a Gaelic speaker, which of course is one of the interesting subtexts around Celtic revival, for the simple reason that both Yeats and Sharp were not Gaelic speakers. Geddes would certainly have a bit of Gaelic simply because his father was a native Gaelic speaker. But it's really interesting, John Duncan using Ella Carmichael in that way, because Ella Carmichael went on to become one of the great Gaelic scholars of her age. And but there's a sharp subtext here in more ways than one, in that Sharp really disliked that image. And I think the reason that he disliked it is because it was the real Fiona MacLeod. It was actually a living Gaelic speaker. And Sharp wanted his Gaelic properly dead, just like ancient Greece. He wanted the Celtic revival to be essentially an Anglophone revival. So there are really interesting issues brought out by that question.
Thank you very much, Murdo. We're going to have to draw things to a close. I thought those talks were really fascinating and great intersections. I think we've lots of questions. I've got loads of questions written down in front of me that we could go into. So thank you very, very much to our speakers today. And thank you very much also to Una Richards from the Scottish Historic Buildings Trust for coming along and saying a few words at the start, and for her support for today's event. Thank you to you, the audience, for your presence and participation and for your questions. The next Scottish Revival Network event will be towards the kind of autumn, winter, end of the year, when we'll have an event on global Scottish revival. So we'll really kind of open things out then. So please keep a lookout for that, and we'd love you to come along to that. When the event closes, because we're online, it will close quite quickly. Sorry for the apparent rudeness, none is intended. But thank you very, very much again for coming along today, and a kind of round of applause, please, as it were, for our speakers. So thank you very much, and cheerio, goodbye.